Well, good morning. I don't know if week to week if I adequately expressed to you guys well enough how grateful I am that you are here. We're a little lower than we have been. You can see we've been at 26 pretty consistently over the last few weeks, but the fact that you guys deem it essential to come here every Sunday and to worship God and to do what God has instructed us to do is just heartening to me and encouraging to me. And I cannot express enough how much I appreciate that there is courage there in that. In this day and age where paranoia and fear are the forefront, for those who show bravery, especially those of you who are older, in the midst of this and basically say, no, we're going to do what we believe to be right, and you are here, that is an admirable thing. And I cannot say thank you enough that you are here. And I think across this country there are preachers and elders who feel the exact same way. So I'm going to start by saying, I don't know if you know this, I have a good friend in New Mexico, and he sent me a little blurb. New Mexico's governor this last week issued an edict that there will be no singing or chanting in worship services in New Mexico. And of course, this is to halt the spread of COVID-19. This coincides with the same order given by Governor Gavin Newsom in California, and it is similar to other edicts made by mayors and governors across the country issued to fight against, and I put that in quotes, against the COVID virus. The mayor of Chicago and the governor of Michigan have actually gone as far as using law enforcement to break up worship services. I don't know how many of you knew that either. This leads us to Romans chapter 13. Turn, if you would, over there. Romans chapter 13 and verse 1. We're going to read a couple of passages. One in Romans, one in 1 Peter. But in Romans chapter 13 and verse 1, it says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. And therefore whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, he being the rulers of the governing authorities, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed." Now turn to 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 13, where Peter writes, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil, and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, but don't use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as servants of God." All right, these are the two definitive passages in the New Testament where we have two apostles who instruct Christians and followers of Christ that they are indeed to be in subjection to the ruling authorities. But as we live in our day and age, I believe we are at a time when we need to start asking some very important questions, such as where and when does our Christian obligation to submit to governing authorities end? I want it known that I'm going to be asking probably more questions than I'm answering. And I'm not doing that to be capricious. I am doing that because sometimes as a preacher, it's important for me to get members to just think critically about things. And I've had a couple of conversations with friends of mine about these very things, discussing government's role and Christians' obligations. And we're going to be looking at 6 examples in the Old Testament and the New Testament. We're going to be looking at Joseph. We're going to be looking at David. We're going to be looking at Jeremiah, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Jesus, and the apostles. We're probably not going to do that this week, but we'll probably get into that next week. And I chose these because I believe that all of these have a different thing to say about being a Christian and being in subjection. And these were servants of God in particular times of history under different types of regimes and governments. And I believe that by examining each of these stories, we'll find out something that is very, very interesting. But let us scrutinize and thoroughly investigate the passages that we just read. Paul and Peter's instructions on submission to government. What do we learn? What do we learn from these passages? Well, I believe first and foremost, the idea of any type of violent upheaval is not going to be tolerated by God and is not what God expects of us as Christians. Let us start by understanding a very, very important truth that I think oftentimes gets overlooked when discussing these 2 passages. In the first century, there was a very pervasive attitude that existed, particularly amongst the Jews. It reared its head with Gentiles as well, but predominantly this was a Jewish issue. And the issue was that bowing down to some Gentile sovereign was somehow a sign of weakness. And the people of God, that be in their minds, the Jews, we are the people of God. And they saw themselves as on a higher plane. And the Gentiles were not as important as they were, as prestigious as they were. And that would include kings and emperors and governors. They were the descendants of Abraham. And some type of subjection to a Gentile monarch was not only viewed as unnecessary, but it was actually viewed as beneath them. And so there was this prevailing attitude that permeated through Jewish society that we don't have to listen to you. We're Jews, you're a Gentile. It doesn't matter if you were the ruler. It doesn't matter if you're the emperor. It doesn't matter if you were the Caesar. There was actually even numerous cases where the desire to be liberated from underneath the boot of Rome, who of course were Gentiles, manifested itself into actual rebellion. In Acts chapter 5, if you'll flip over there, I understand this is a discussion concerning the apostles, and that the apostles were supposed to shut up, and we'll be dealing with this story later, coming from a different angle. But I want you to look at what Gamaliel says. Gamaliel first says, if these men are from God, you're not going to be able to stop it. But we actually get a little bit of a history lesson in Acts chapter 5 and verse 35, when he said, "Men of Israel, take care what you are about to do with these men. But for before these days, Theodas rose up, claiming to be somebody, and a number of men, about 400, joined him. He was killed, and all who followed him were dispersed and came to nothing." Verse 37, "And then after him, Judas the Galilean rose up in the days of the census and drew away some of the people after him. He too perished, and all who followed him were scattered." So Gamaliel actually introduces us to 2 separate occurrences in the history of the Jews where you literally had these rebellious leaders who instigated insurrection. And this was not the only time it happened, and it was going to even happen after the life of Gamaliel was over. It was something that happened quite often. And in fact, one of the realities is that Pilate, when Pilate became governor of Judea, it's fascinating to read how there was this sort of animus that existed between Caesar and Pilate. which is why Pilate got stuck with this job, which was literally the armpit job of the entire Roman Empire. And do you know why? Because the Jews were constantly creating insurrection, and they did not like to bow down to Gentiles. And so it was a hard and difficult job. It was a job practically going nowhere. You'll also recall that one of the apostles is actually called a zealot. Now, a zealot could be referring to a couple of different things. It could be referring to his zealousness for the Jewish religion. Later on, even after he becomes a Christian, or a follower of Christ may be a better way to put it, he's still referred to as a zealot. So it could be a reference to just his passion. But the reality is there was actually a political movement during the time of Christ and afterwards. The zealots were those who sought to undermine Roman rule and authority. So having this in mind, it is important when we read Peter's account, when he basically says, be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be the emperor as supreme or even a governor. And the idea behind that is even those who are in smaller roles, you are to be in subjection to. Now, if we understand that the mindset of many Jews was, I'm not going to do that, we can see why Peter and Paul were so strongly emphasizing to Christians that no, your attitude is to respect these people who are in authority. Again, why? Because the first impulse was often to flout it. Paul expresses a similar thought, though I believe Paul's thoughts, and I think this is important because I think it gets forgotten. Paul's thoughts are a continuation of the end of chapter 12. We forget about that. Remember, there was no chapter separations when these letters were written. And go to chapter 12 of the book of Romans and start in verse 17, where Paul says, repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For by so doing you will heap burning coals upon his head. And do not overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And then he moves into chapter 13. And I find that to be of the utmost importance, because you couple that with verse 2 of chapter 13, when Paul writes, therefore whoever resists the authorities, resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur in judgment. It's probably important to know what that word resist means, don't you think? That is actually a Greek word, athestomai. And it is the same word which is used in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 5, where it tells us that God resists the proud or opposes the proud. You know, it's actually a military term. It is a military term that indicates total opposition to, or even a type of going to war against. God goes to war against the proud. And so when we think about verse 2 again, those who would seek to resist, there is this sort of a physical pushback idea behind that, especially if you couple it with the end of chapter 12 that talks about returning evil for evil. And vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. This mentality of retaliation via violent means. There seems to be, again, a sincere effort here on Paul's part, specifically since he is talking to Jews, don't forget, who are in the heart of the Roman Empire. What's the book called? Romans. Who would he be writing to? People in Romans? People in Rome? People in Rome? And he's basically telling them no type of insurrection is going to be tolerated. The second thing we learn is government is instituted by God. But it's important to note, what was it instituted for? Well, if you read through Peter and Paul's account, it comes, to me, obviously clear that the purpose of government is to establish civil society. It is to establish protection for its citizens. And any type, even if it was a Christian, any type of violent opposition, any type of violent unrest endangers civil society. It endangers citizens. Notice how both writers emphasize that. Notice Peter. Rulers, he says, are sent by God to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. Paul goes into even more depth when he says there is no authority except from God and those that have been instituted by God. In other words, I don't necessarily believe that means that God has picked and chosen throughout history who is going to be king here, governor here. I think what that means is he has established the means by which these people can come into power. God allows it to be. God allows these people to be kings and emperors. God allows them to be governors and mayors and presidents of the United States. He then goes on to say, and they're not supposed to be there for a terror. This is of the utmost importance. Governments were not established to create terror in society, but actually to promote good conduct in society. Then it says, Paul very explicitly says, he is God's servant for good. And then he concludes by saying this is the reason why you pay taxes, because the authorities are the ministers of God. Twice he says, I have to do a slight detour. Twice Paul says that government are to be ministers of God and servants of God. I find that to be of the utmost importance. And then he continues on saying, and these are the things that they attend to. In other words, you pay your taxes so that government can carry out these specific tasks. As we discussed a couple of weeks ago, God operates in the realm of law and order and truth. It is the devil who operates in the realm of chaos, of anarchy, of lies. And Paul gives us the description of a government that is operating as it is supposed to. A government that protects the law abiding. That's what it was instituted for. Notice, that's what he's saying. It punishes the delinquent. Going back up, rulers are not a terror to good conduct. Rulers are supposed to be a terror to bad conduct. Peter says that the purpose of government is to punish those who do evil, not to do good. Both of them say that. So a government that is functioning properly does not reward bad behavior, it punishes bad behavior. It doesn't punish good behavior, but it points to good behavior as exemplary. This that Paul is describing here is a government that does not seek to blur the lines between the two. Or a government that gives preferential treatment to one section of society over another. For instance, the wealthy and the well-connected over the poor. But rather, it is a government that seeks to create tranquility and security. Now, pause for a moment and ask yourself a very important question. How often throughout history has a government like that been in existence? And the reality is, not very often. In fact, in the writings of the prophets, we see the abuse of power consistently condemned. Acts of injustice ascribed to those in positions of power, condemned. Priests, judges, officials. It seems like nearly every single minor and major prophet condemns governments that blur the line between right and wrong, governments that have abused their power, governments that have sought to help the well-connected and the wealthy while at the same time completely overlooking those who were in power. Bribes were taking place, graft was taking place, corruption was taking place. Go all the way back to just a couple of good men of the Bible, Eli and Samuel. They were judges of Israel, but yet their sons were some of the most corrupt and crooked people that we read about in the Old Testament. They used their rank, they used their title for bribery, for extortion, and sickly and sadly enough, for promiscuity. But in spite of the consistency of the misuse of power by the governments throughout history, the prophets and the apostles still emphatically insist that the purpose of the government is to oversee a civilized and communal populace. Safety and security are to be government's primary function. Hence, when Paul says and Peter say, don't you as a Christian break the law or be rebellious or be a thorn in their side. Government is there to keep the peace. Don't you become a part of the problem of not keeping the peace. That's why Peter says, live as people who are free. Don't use your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but live as servants of God. I find it very interesting that he says that right smack in the middle of talking about being in subjection to government. Paul says, do what is good and you will receive his approval. But if you do wrong, you should be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. With that simple statement, God endorses laws that would punish the delinquent and the criminal, whatever that punishment might be. Why would God endorse that? Because God is about civility, and God is about order, and God is about law. And so God, from the beginning, from Genesis on, is a God of accountability. God is a God of responsibility. And he is a God of consequences. All the way back in Ecclesiastes chapter 8 verse 2, I say, keep the king's command, wrote the writer of Ecclesiastes, because of God's oath to him. Be not hasty to go from his presence, and don't take your stand in an evil cause, for he does whatever he pleases. But here's the question. What if the government is no longer seeking peace and security? What if the government is no longer seeking the welfare of the citizenry? What if the government has become the enemy of society and actually of God? What if government seeks to usurp God and replace him? These are all very important questions. As Christians, we are supposed to submit to the elders, correct? I think all of us would agree with that. But what if the elders are no longer pursuing what is spiritually beneficial for the church? What if an elder begins to advocate for that which is blatantly unscriptural? What if he becomes drunk with power? Does the submission to that elder continue then? In the book of 3 John, verse 9, we're introduced to this character by the name of Diotrephes, who by all accounts was an elder. John writes, I have written something to the church, but there's this Diotrephes who likes to put himself first, does not acknowledge our authority, and so if I come, I will bring up what he is doing, talking wicked nonsense against us, and not content with that, he refuses to welcome the brethren, and he stops those who want to, and he puts them out of the church. In other words, Diotrephes has become drunk with power. Beloved, do not imitate evil, but imitate good. Whoever does good is from God. Whoever does evil is not from God. Is John here advocating for continued submission to Diotrephes after he has clearly been established as no longer operating for the good of the saints and basically operating for his own self? This is an important question to ask. That's all I'm doing right now, is asking questions. When children are called to obey their parents, it establishes the chain of command, it establishes authority, and the Bible also says, children, obey your parents because this is right. But what if a parent is abusive? What if a parent is unkind, cruel, sadistic? Would we advocate for the child remaining in that condition and being submissive? We might say what the Bible advocates is a respect for the office of the parent, and that is unquestionably true. But it doesn't change the situation. What if a parent is out and out abusing a child? The Bible also makes very clear in Ephesians and Colossians that fathers are not supposed to provoke their children to wrath. And what exactly does that mean? And here's an interesting story from the Old Testament. In 1 Samuel chapter 20, one of the great characters of the Old Testament is Jonathan. In verse 30, and Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan, his own son. And he said to him, "You son of a perverse and rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse, David, lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom shall be established. Therefore, send and bring him to me, for he will surely die." And Jonathan answered Saul his father, "Why should he be put to death? What has he done?" But Saul hurled his spear at him to strike him, and so Jonathan knew that his father was determined to put David to death. And Jonathan rose from the table in fierce anger, and he ate no food, and he was grieved for David because his father had disgraced him. And from that moment on, Jonathan would do everything in his power to actually go against the wishes of his father and to set David free. Interesting story. When wives are abused, would we advocate for them to remain in a situation that could ultimately lead to their death? The only passage that we might go to that could advocate for this sort of universal submission is a continuation of 1 Peter, and I think it's important for us to go there. In 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 18, Paul says, "Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect," is a passage I read this morning. "Not only to the good and to the gentle, but also even to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing when mindful of God one endures sorrow while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if when you suffer and sin and are beaten for it you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it and you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God." And so in 1 Peter chapter 2, the suffering servant is actually instructed to patiently endure. So we should obviously take this verse into account. In conclusion, I know I haven't given you a lot of answers, I've given you a lot of things to ponder. I will say that there seems to be an idea here of this personal relationship between the servant and the master that obviously exists, and the forbearance of the servant in the midst of unfair treatment, potentially leading to the conversion of the vicious master. Now, when it comes to government in the relationship to man is very cold, very abstract, very distant. Most of us are never going to meet the president. Most of us are never going to meet the mayor. Most of us are never going to meet the governor. This particular relationship is taken down to this very personal one-on-one. If your master treats you in such an abusive fashion and you remain faithful working hard for him, it is altogether possible that it could lead to his conversion. Well, look, it doesn't say that. I understand it, but go to the next chapter. Because there is a continuation of thought going into 1 Peter chapter 3. And you know why I know that? Because the word likewise appears at the top. After he's finished talking about the attitude of the servant towards the master, he then moves into chapter 3 and he says, "Likewise, wives, be in subjection to your own husbands, even to those that don't obey the word." Well, for what purpose? Well, that they, the husband who is not obedient, might be won by the wife's conduct. In other words, when the husband sees, as verse 2 tells us, the respectful and the pure conduct of the wife, it does something to his conscience that causes him to potentially obey the gospel of Jesus Christ. I believe the same thought is present with the servant and the master relationship. That's why they're used here in conjunction. Now, that doesn't change the fact that this idea of suffering in the midst of persecution is not something that we as Christians are going to have to humbly endure. We're going to be talking about that next week. We're talking about first century Christians. But I would have us seriously contemplate these ideas of when Paul is talking about government, he's talking about men who are supposed to be God's servants. Well, what happens when they are no longer God's servants? These are important questions, and we'll address them more. Because if people are not working for God, who are they working for? That's a very important question to ask. If a government is no longer interested in civil society, and it's no longer interested in protecting the innocent, and it's no longer interested in protecting people's security and safety, and God says that's paramount. It is God's servant for those who do evil. It is God's protection for those who do good. What happens? Who are they working for if they have abandoned that? Listen, you guys are answering, I understand, it's an important question to ask, because Paul very specifically says they are God's ministers and servants for good. So what happens when they have become servants for evil? Just throwing questions out there for us to ponder and to think about. And next week we're going to look at these 6 particular characters. And I could have put Jonathan in there and put that as the 7th. But we're going to look again at Joseph. We're going to look at David. We're going to look at Jeremiah. We're going to look at Daniel, Shadrach, and Abednego. Jesus himself and the apostles. And I think each of them has something very interesting to say about government and our, as Christians and followers of God's response to it. Okay. We're off to a rousing start. As always, we offer an invitation to anyone this morning who believes that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And ultimately, that's the greatest decision that you will ever make. Ultimately, we all have to submit ourselves before God. He is the ultimate authority, and Christ is the ultimate authority. And if your desire this morning is to give your life over to Him, make Him king of your life, confess His name before men, repent of the life that you've been living, and be baptized to have your sins washed away, now is the time as we stand and as we sing the invitation song.